Gus Van Sant brings the infamous story of Tony Kiritsis, the disgruntled Indianapolis businessman who took the law or matters or his grievance very much into his own hands in Dead Man's Wire. Now, this is a story that I knew about. I had seen a documentary years ago, kind of a Mondo documentary called The Killing of America, and it features a little segment on this. And I always thought it was very fascinating and kind of disturbing, and it always stuck in my head. Basically, the story, the true story, this film is based on a true story, was in the winter of 1977, Tony Kiritsis had an issue with a loan company. He felt that they had wronged him in some way. He felt that they had kind of hosed him on a business deal that he was setting up that he thought was going to be this big shopping center he was going to build. And he felt that they didn't allow him to proceed. They stalled him and they charged him all this money. And then they basically gave the land to somebody else or sold it to somebody else. He was so outraged that he showed up at this loan company and took hostage one of their vice president or the president, the son of the owners, at least as far as the feature film I'm talking about is concerned, and put the titular Dead Man's Wire around him. He had a sawed-off shotgun pointed at the back of the neck of this businessman with a little thin metal wire noose around the businessman's neck that led to the trigger finger on the gun. So basically, Mr. Kiritsis was saying, if I fall, this gun's going to go off and the guy's dead. If you try to do anything to me, if you try to wrench me away from this guy, the gun's going to go off and the guy's dead. And it was this ongoing, covered more or less live by the media at the time. Again, if I didn't mention the winter of 77 in Indianapolis. And it was this one of the early examples of live news coverage of something really bad going on. And the news covering this in terms of this is shocking and this is newsworthy and people watching it and the whole endeavor sort of being like, are we going to see a guy's head get blown off? Which is kind of a sick instinct. So the story of the film follows pretty closely the story of the events of those couple of days. I think it takes place over the span of maybe 3 days or so. I could be wrong on that time, but it's multiple days. It wasn't multiple hours. It was like a period of time where Kiritsis stayed awake and was getting increasingly angry. He was a very angry man, and took matters into his own hands via the modern miracle of a shotgun. So, and a little pistol that was tucked into his back belt. So the film lays this out again. I've done a little research. It's pretty accurate to what went on as far as we all know. And it stars Bill Skarsgård as Tony Kiritsis and Dacre. I'm going to probably mispronounce this. Dacre. Mr. Montgomery, who people would recognize from Stranger Things as Richard Hall, Dick Hall, who is the victim. And it's really the two of them for the most part in this film. We do have Al Pacino playing the Mr. Dick Hall's father, the guy who Tony Kiritsis really has a beef with, who's away in Florida, whose wife is played by Lynch, who I haven't seen anything in a long time. Cool to see Lynch again. And then you have Coleman Domingo as this local cool jazz, super eloquent radio DJ who Kiritsis is a fan of, and basically Domingo winds up being like the go-between between the media and the police and Kiritsis. And so he's the super soul in this, if you've seen Vanishing Point. And you also have Cary Elwes as a cop. Now, I will say, it took me a while before I realized it was Cary Elwes. He's very good and very not good in this film. Let's say this. He's good in that he disappears into this role. He's got a lot of 70s like hair and facial hair, and he plays a local cop. And it took me a while. I didn't realize it was Cary Elwes in the film. But as soon as he opened his mouth, I'm going to go there. As soon as he opened his mouth, I'm like, that's a British guy. I have a long-standing thing. I love British actors. I love British TV and film and media and music and comedy and all that. But it just makes my skin crawl when I hear a bad British person doing an American accent. Full American, I call it. And it was egregious with Cary Elwes. Like, it was really bad. It was like, when British people do American accents, they tend to go about 3 ways. They go nasal, they curl their R's really, really hard, or they try to go Southern. And Elwes didn't go Southern because he played a cop in Indianapolis, but he went super nasal, and it was super phony. It took me out of the movie. Even if I didn't realize it was a guy who was British doing an American accent, I'd be like, why is he talking like that? It's like he's a cartoon character, and it's a shame because otherwise his performance is pretty good, but the voice just killed it for me. And the faux American thing, I never understand why it's like that. Yes, people will say they're actors, they can do any role. That's true, and there are all kinds of actors, but it seems like it's almost impossible to watch a film or a TV show where you don't have a British or an Australian person playing an American. And this film, its two leads were Swedish and Australian. So let me get into some quibbles here. So I've sort of basically told you what the story is about. It is about this guy who feels like he has been wronged, taking somebody prisoner, and he's sort of like fighting the man. And the question you have as an audience member, hopefully, is this guy right or wrong in doing this? I have an answer, but my answer is, my opinion of the whole film is so tainted by knowing the actual story and by knowing what the people look like in the actual story. And that's the big conundrum here for me. So, like, if you see photos or footage of the actual Kiritsis and Hall, they don't really look like the people in this film. Now, Montgomery looks like a much younger version of Hall. Skarsgård looks nothing like Kiritsis. I would say more ideal casting for this film, if you wanted to be sort of accurate to what the people generally looked like and what their demeanor was, would have been Joe Pesci in his prime as Kiritsis and like Woody Harrelson now as Hall. I did look it up. I'm being pedantic, maybe the only review that talks about this. At the time of the incident in 1977, Kiritsis was 45 and Hall was 42. The cast here in those for their counterparts are 35 and 33. So they're about a decade younger than the guys actually were. But we're talking about a movie. And I have to remind myself this because when people go nuts about a film being different from a book that it's based on, I generally want to say, but you're not watching the book. The book exists, the book its own thing. The film is taking the ideas of the book and turning it into something that works on screen. So, yes, the film that is Dead Man's Wire is very close to the facts of the story for the most part. The Coleman Domingo character actually was not an African American. He was a white guy and a bit older, but there was a guy at a radio station, and he wasn't a cool jazz DJ. He was like a news director at the station. But for the most part, the casting is pretty close to the people who were really there, and the characters are pretty close to the people who were really there. They nail the era pretty well. There's some pretty cool period music that's played throughout, and it is a compelling film. But for me, what kept working against me was that I know how it all plays out, and I know what the demeanor of the real Tony Kiritsis was like. And I've subsequently then watched a documentary. I read somewhere that this film was based on a documentary from, I think, 2018 or so called Dead Man's Line, which is available on YouTube, and I highly recommend. It's a good documentary. It's a fascinating tale. If you don't watch Dead Man's Wire, so you don't know where the story goes, that's an alternate way of experiencing this. And having watched all that and knowing what I knew, I didn't feel like Tony Kiritsis was the good guy in this story. And I feel like Dead Man's Wire kind of leans toward making him an anti-hero, or saying that he was kind of in the right, or he was justified for what he was doing. And maybe that's just in his mind, that's what it was. A different person might take something different away from this film. How do I feel about the movie itself? I think it was pretty good for the most part. I think Skarsgård is pretty good in this. I think Montgomery is good in this. I think, again, other than that Cary Elwes accent, it's a pretty straightforward, decent rendition of what really happened. And they do cool things where one of the characters we follow is, it's a news crew, excuse me, where Myha'la plays this young field reporter who wants to like bump up to the big time and bump up to prime time. And we cut back between the Kiritsis story and the police and her trying to cover the story. And when they do that, they cut to 4x3 vintage looking video footage. And in amongst all of that, and occasional black and white still photos, amongst all of that, we occasionally get actual news footage of the day. And it's all so well done that you can't always tell what is the vintage news footage and what is the new vintage looking news footage. And I greatly appreciate that, because so often I see things that try to fake old footage, and they do it the same lame way, which tells me it's not really old, or they get something wrong about the era or about the look. In this movie, Gus Van Sant knows what he's doing. This movie really nails it. And then during the end credits, you do sort of like, there's credits, and then there's a clip of the actual Kiritsis press conference that you see in the movie dramatized. You see the real thing, and then there's credits, and then there's more actual footage, so you can get to see what these people really looked like and how close the film really was to recreating the actual incidents, which I appreciate. The stretch of the film takes place with Kiritsis and Hall in Kiritsis' apartment, and the conversations they have and how that all goes down. That, I'm not sure how accurate that is. I know Dick Hall did write a book a few years back before he passed away about those hours he spent, those days he spent in captivity, and hopefully the film drew from that. So maybe some of those conversations are, according to Hall's memory, maybe they're accurate. I don't know. Anyway, I thought the movie was good. The only thing I have to say is it did feel like it was a bit more on the side of the perpetrator of this, which I feel from what I've seen is not really right. To me, Kiritsis comes off back in his day as a very angry man who chose a violent and threatening and irrational way to deal with what he perceived to be a wrong. From everything I've seen and read, he really wasn't wronged. It was just the way he perceived things. He was a guy who had a rough childhood and had a chip on his shoulder about a lot of things, and apparently had done something like this not that long before with a family member, basically held them hostage because he felt like somebody wronged him. So to me, trying to make him into some kind of a folk hero in the music they play at the end of the film, I was like, I don't know that he was really the good guy in this film. And that, and again, me having a hard time reconciling how much I enjoyed the movie knowing so much about it. It's like watching a biopic or watching any kind of film based on a true story. If you really know the true story, you're not going with the narrative of the film on its own terms. You've got a checklist where you're like, yep, that person looks like the real thing. Yep, he really said that. Yep, that really happened that way. So you probably will get a lot more out of Dead Man's Wire if you don't know the Tony Kiritsis story. But I recommend Dead Man's Wire. I think it's good. It's a smallish, indie-ish movie. It's probably not going to be in theaters much longer as I say this, but it'll be out there streaming. And I highly recommend watching Dead Man's Line, which is available on YouTube.